Hello, and welcome to another mind-expanding episode of Our Church, a series where we are exploring the different images and symbols that make up St. Boniface. Today we will be looking at the statues of Mary and Joseph mounted in the niches that are on either side of the sanctuary. The practice of having images or statues of saints in churches goes all the way back to ancient times. It's a visual way of telling the stories of our faith, and certainly the stories of the lives of the saints are an important part of that story. And of all the saints, Mary and Joseph have pride of place, particularly because of their close relationship with Jesus. Their story is his story, and so that is why we have them in such a prominent place in our church. We'll begin with St. Joseph. Personally, I've always thought of St. Joseph as sort of the unsung hero of the Holy Family. He wasn't the Son of God like Jesus. He wasn't conceived without original sin like Mary. He was just an ordinary person whom God called to do extraordinary things, and he answered that call. And because of that, I always look up to St. Joseph as a great example for us, ordinary people called by God to do extraordinary things. As is common with many of our images of the saints, we have a number of symbols that are part of our statues of Mary and Joseph. And we'll begin by looking at Joseph and the symbols he has in his right hand. First, we see an image of a basket of fruit, and beneath that we see a carpenter's square. The basket of fruit symbolizes Joseph the provider. He was the great provider for the Holy Family, putting food on the table, a roof over their head, and taking care of Mary and Jesus. And how did he do that? Well, that's what the other image is, the carpenter's square. Joseph was a carpenter, and it was through his trade as a carpenter that he was able to provide for the Holy Family. And Joseph then becomes, in that sense, a great symbol and example for all workers. In fact, May 1st, we celebrate the feast of Joseph the worker, reminding all of us that, like Joseph, our work can be an important part of how we serve the will of God. In Joseph's left hand, we find a lily, and the lily symbolizes his fidelity. Of course, his fidelity to his wife Mary, with whom he remained chaste throughout their married lives. But above all, it represents his fidelity to God, the God who called him to be the husband of Mary and foster father of Jesus. And Joseph was faithful to that calling, even in great difficulty. And what a great lesson and example that again is for us that are called by God to fidelity, even in the face of difficulties we might struggle with. So we can look to Joseph and his fidelity as an example of being faithful ourselves, even in times of difficulty. We now turn to our statue of the Virgin Mary. And our statue is a variation of a very common image of Mary found in a number of different devotions and, again, various ways. We think of the Mary, the Mother of Grace, being an example, the miraculous medal being an example. But what this generally is understood to be is a depiction of the Immaculate Conception, of course symbolically, when Mary was conceived without the stain of original sin, to be the worthy mother of her Son. Mary is seen trampling a snake while standing over the earth. This recalls for us the creation story of Adam and Eve in the book of Genesis, where humanity fell into sin through the deception of the snake, a symbol of the devil. Because of the fall of humanity, all of creation was thrown into disorder and was doomed to destruction. In Mary, God begins a new creation. Like Eve, Mary is created without original sin. Unlike Eve, however, Mary remains faithful to her sinless origin. Her yes to God, through which she rejected the serpent's lies and agreed to be the mother of Christ, cancels Eve's no, through which she rejected God and instead believed the serpent. Because of this, Christ is conceived in Mary's womb, and she becomes the mother not only of Christ, but of the whole world, freed from Satan's power and redeemed in Christ. The crown of stars, which appears to be a later addition to our statue, is another common image for Mary. It is taken from the book of Revelation, chapter 12, and the symbol of the woman about to give birth. And that, beginning with verse 1, reads, "A great sign appeared in the sky, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was with child and wailed aloud in pain as she labored to give birth. Then another sign appeared in the sky. It was a huge red dragon, with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on its heads were 7 diadems. Its tail swept away a third of the stars in the sky, and hurled them down to the earth. Then the dragon stood before the woman about to give birth, to devour her child when she gave birth. She gave birth to a son, a male child, destined to rule all the nations with an iron rod. Her child was caught up to God and his throne. The woman herself fled into the desert, where she had a place prepared by God, that there she might be taken care of for 1,260 days." This woman's son, destined to rule all the nations, has traditionally been understood to be a symbol of Jesus. And so tradition has seen in the woman crowned with stars an image of Mary, who reigns with Christ in victory for all eternity as Queen of heaven and earth. Our statues of Mary and Joseph, as well as all the images of the saints that we have in our church, are a constant reminder to us that even when Mass is only celebrated by a few people, or even only one person, we never celebrate it alone. We always celebrate the Mass as part of a greater communion, our communion with Christ, uniting us with all who are in communion with Christ, beginning with the saints in glory, but not ending there. We are always together in communion with Christ, even when we are physically separated. And that's what these images remind us of. So through our communion with Christ, through our communion with the saints, may we remember our communion with one another and continue to work toward that day when all will be one in Christ. So thank you for joining us for this episode of Our Church. Please keep checking back for new episodes and keep growing in your faith during this time by remembering that we are one church at St. Boniface.